It's the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccerphiles Canada. We're looking at World Cup 2026 qualifying in the Asian region. This is round one, the preliminary round. Our seventh pairing is Yemen versus Sri Lanka. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada, Series 21. I'm Kevin, and today, we are at the beginning of a massive set of series looking at the World Cup 2026 qualifying. Series 21 will cover 3 rounds of qualifying for the Asian region, or the AFC, and this is the 7th of 10 media casts covering the preliminary round of qualifying. These are the bottom 20 teams in the AFC region playing home and away, the 10 winners advancing to the second round. So again, this is set 7 of 10 covering Yemen versus Sri Lanka. And we have been wanting to cover the weaker countries in world soccer because they get so little attention. Most media casts focus on the big teams, but these small teams have an interesting history too. However, some of them never get on the radar because they're often knocked out in early rounds. In addition, they're often hard to separate in the minds of even ardent soccer fans because they just clump into a nebulous category of weak teams at the bottom of the table. So part of the goal here is to make them more distinct. Throughout, we'll be mentioning the teams they beat or the teams that usually beat them. And we name those teams on purpose so that fans can, little by little, build an impression of how strong each team is relative to those around them. At this point, we usually give some information about our past, present, and future media casts. However, we don't want too much information in our introduction here, so we've made a separate media cast that covers what we've been doing recently and what we plan to cover in the next 9 months. So that will be published around October 15th, 2023, and can also be found at the addresses that YouTube watchers can see on the graphic here. And we'll also give a link to that in the show notes. All right, but on with the show here. We will cover the 7th of 10 preliminary pairings, and we have 3 sections. So part 1 will introduce a bit about the countries competing, their location and population. And part 2 is the main part of the media cast. We do an overview of each team's history and their recent form. And this series features a deep dive into each team's history in World Cup qualifying. The Asian region is further divided into what we call localities, and they play a big role. So part of that history touches on this often neglected aspect of the team's history. And then part 3 will be a comparison of the 2 teams competing in terms of ranking, head-to-head record, and odds. And we'll end with a discussion of their prospects and our prediction for this round. Okay, so let's jump into it and begin by looking at our first team, which is Yemen. And before 1990, there was a North Yemen and a South Yemen. Yemen is considered a continuation of North Yemen, at least in terms of their soccer record. And that information, forget that. Yemen is located south of Saudi Arabia. It borders Oman to the northeast and Saudi Arabia everywhere else. And in terms of population, it is 34.5 million, making it 44th largest country in the world and the 19th largest country in Asia. Sri Lanka is a tropical island nation off the southeast coast of the Indian subcontinent. So about 31 kilometers south of India, southeast of India. The population of Sri Lanka is 21.9 million. So they are 61st in the world and 23rd in Asia. So about 10 million people less than Yemen. Okay, let's get into part 2, the main part of the podcast, covering the history of the teams, beginning with Yemen and an overview of their participation and strength. And yes, the graphics on the YouTube there are very small, but don't worry, we will look at them one by one. So just in this overview, you can get a sense of their participation and general strength. And Yemen was divided into North and South Yemen until 1990. The mantle of Yemen followed North Yemen's history, the north being more populated actually, though smaller in size. South Yemen actually entered qualification first in 1976. They otherwise completed only qualifications for the 1986 World Cup and the 1988 Asian Cup. North Yemen entered Asian Cup play in 1984 and World Cup play in 1986. They participated consistently in both, except for missing the 1992 Asian Cup. Yemen is also part of the West African Football Federation. They are, in fact, one of the original members from 2000, unlike the other Gulf nations that joined in 2008. However, Yemen did not participate until 2010, the tournament having started from 2000. They have participated in 3 of the 4 editions since 2010, but didn't enter in 2014. Yemen is also a Gulf nation and was eligible to join the Gulf Cup from its start in 1970. However, they entered only from 2003, though participation has been consistent since then. Finally, they also take part in the Arab Cup. That tournament was an on-again, off-again tournament from 1963. And so were Yemen on again, off again, completing in 1966 qualification for only one of the 7 versions until 1998. From 2000, though, they have participated consistently, although there have only been 3 editions since that time. And we'll take a closer look at those a bit later on. In terms of their strength, Yemen is a 4th-tier team. They have had campaigns where they competed with 3rd-tier teams and have even taken points off 2nd- and 1st-tier teams. But they have never reached the final round of World Cup qualification and only recently reached their first Asian Cup. So at the campaign level, they are 4th-tier, but perhaps at the upper end of that range at the game level. Okay, let's zoom in a bit, quite literally in terms of the graphics, and do an overview of their World Cup history. North Yemen lost all games in their first 2 campaigns in 1986 and 1990. But when North and South combined to play simply as Yemen in 1994, they proved competitive. They improved over the next 2 campaigns to finish 2nd in their qualifying group in 2002, just 1 point behind the UAE, who advanced. But that was as close as they would ever come to reaching the final round. They declined after that, but their last place finish in 2006 was at least partly a result of the group being much tougher. Nevertheless, they fell in knockout rounds to Thailand and Iraq over the following 2 campaigns. And in 2018, during a civil war in their country, they were less competitive than usual. In 2022, they returned to earning some game level results, as we will see when we get to the recent games. Anyway, in both 2018 2020, they finished last in their semi-final group. Okay, on to the Regional Cup or the Asian Cup. They finished, they first entered the Asian Cup in 1984 as North Yemen, and in the World Cup, as in the World Cup, they lost all of their games to finish last in the group. They were, in fact, beaten soundly in all games, even by Pakistan. But if, as in the World Cup, it seemed their strength came when North and South combined, it was not the case here. Still playing under the name of North Yemen, they were competitive in 1988, tying China in their opener and finishing 3rd of 6 teams. They did not enter in 1992, and in Asian Cup play at least were weaker as Yemen than they had been as North Yemen. They returned in 1996, but from then on only earned a smattering of points in each campaign, usually over other fourth tier or fifth tier teams, and finishing in the bottom half of the table, except for 2000, where they finished third of five ahead of very weak teams. 2011 was a bit better, finishing ahead of Bahrain, but they lost all games to them and Malaysia to finish bottom in 2015. And 2019 brought on a new event in their history, so we will look at that when we get to recent tournaments. Anyway, generally proving a fourth tier team, particularly in the Asian Cup. Now we take a look at local cups, and it's a little bit complicated because they're part of several groups. As mentioned, they're an original member of WAF, or the West African Football Federation, but only participated from 2010 onwards. They reached the semi-finals in 2010, which sounds impressive, but actually only entailed a win over Palestine. They did, however, take Kuwait to penalties in the semi-final. However, they have failed to pass the group stage since, not entering in 2014 and losing all games in 2019. Actually, the WAF tournament is recently played only inconsistently. There's only been one edition after 2014. They actually said there was an edition supposed to be played in 2023, but it looks like that's not happening. Perhaps the WAF Cup struggles to compete with other cups in the region, the Gulf Cup of Nations. That's a long-standing tournament played consistently from 1970. Yemen didn't enter the Gulf Cup of Nations until 2003 and are notably weak among the mostly second-tier teams. They've never passed the group stage of that Gulf Cup. In the Arab Cup, they joined, oh, sorry, I'll move the graphics there. They joined only three of the editions. No, they've joined four editions in 1996, 2002, 2012, and 2021. Those last two in 2012 and 21 are the last two editions of the Cup. So you can see that it's kind of very sporadic in terms of how often it's played. However, in 2021, it became a bigger tournament because it was backed by FIFA. So it looks to be a bigger competition going forward. Yemen have been knocked out in the group stage in every edition they've joined, except for 2021, where there was a qualifying round and they didn't pass it. Okay, now let's get into our deep dive, the World Cup finals, and that begins for Yemen in 1986. They lost all games in the three-team group, and they finished last behind Syria and Kuwait. It was the same in the second edition, where Bahrain withdrew from their group, so making it a three-team group again, and there they finished behind Saudi Arabia and Syria. However, they proved quite competitive in 1994, finishing third of five ahead of Jordan and Pakistan. Perhaps a stronger team with North and South Korea combining to play as Yemen. The campaign featured a home win over China, spoiling China's bid for first place. 1998 was equally good, as they finished second of four, a point ahead of Indonesia, who they tied twice. And 2002 was better still, coming as close as they would ever come to the final round of qualification. The group finished with UAE on top, United Arab Emirates, with 12 points, and Yemen and India both with 11 and with identical records. Yemen finished second on more goals scored. 2006 seems much weaker, as they finished last in the group, but the competition was a lot tougher and they did well at the game level. They beat United Arab Emirates at home for the second tournament in a row and tied North Korea at home and Thailand away. Thailand finished ahead and would get the better of them in the following edition in 2010. After beating Maldives in the first knockout round, they were bested there by Thailand in the second. 2014 saw them receiving a bye in the first round, but Iraq proved too strong a team in the second round, although they did earn a home draw as they had against Thailand. They comfortably won a preliminary round in the 2018 edition over Pakistan, but finished last in the subsequent five-team group stage. They earned a win in the Philippines for their only points, but the Southeast Asians were at a good point in their history and finished third. So it was Philippines and Bahrain finishing ahead of them. That they had been in a preliminary in 2018 was a result of a flawed FIFA ranking, which had them among the bottom 12 teams in the region. This was probably not the case, and they rightly earned a bye in the preliminary round in 2022. So we'll take a look at the 2022 campaign under the recent campaigns, but just to finish that story with the preliminary round. The preliminary round expanded from 12 to 20 teams for the 2026 World Cup, and so they were kind of caught in the net there. Okay, and we do move on to their recent history, and that begins with the 2019 Asian Cup. And 2018 World Cup qualifying made up the first two rounds of qualification, and despite finishing last in round two, they still had a chance to actually get through to the final round of qualifying. Asia kind of giving several chances for the weaker teams to make it. So finishing last in the group didn't advance them. So in round 2B of 3, they beat Maldives in both games to earn passage into round 3 of 3. They went undefeated there in round 3 of 3, twice tying the Philippines, but also tying Tajikistan and Nepal once each to finish second and actually advanced to the Asian Cup. It was an impressive accomplishment for a team that started ranked one of the 12 weakest teams in the region, although, as we've said, that probably wasn't the case. Anyway, they were well out of their league by the time they got to the tournament. Amidst politically tumultuous times in their country, they came into the tournament and lost all three games. So beginning with a 5-0 loss to Iran, a 3-0 loss to Iraq, and a 2-0 loss to Vietnam followed. So yes, that was probably to be expected, but reaching the tournament was the achievement there. Moving on to their next tournament, that is the West African Football Federation, or WAF Cup, in 2019. And here they beat Lebanon and tied Syria, but lost to Palestine and Iraq to finish third of 5 in the group stage, and only the top team advanced from that group. Next is another more localized tournament. It's the Arab Cup. In 2021, and there wasn't many teams playing in the preliminary round for that cup, so just the weakest teams, and they were one of them, so they had to play off against Mauritania, and those playoff games took place in Qatar, who hosted the tournament, and unfortunately Yemen lost, so they never actually got to the group stage of the tournament. World Cup 2012, they did receive a bye in round 1 of 3 this time. And in round 2 of 3, they started well with a draw to Singapore and then at home to group winners Saudi Arabia. They also won at home to Palestine, but fared poorly in the tournament, losing all 4 games and finishing last in round 2 of 3. I should have said in the campaign rather than in the tournament. So pretty good start there, but finished last. And as we've said, these these 2 rounds do make up the first 2 rounds of 2023 Asian Cup qualifying, so we'll get to that shortly. But in between, there was the Gulf Cup of Nations played in Iraq in 2023, and there they also lost all 3 games to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the host Iraq. A competitive game in the middle with Oman, where they lost 3-2, but they scored no goals against Saudi Arabia or Iraq. Okay, now here is that Asian Cup 2023 qualifying. So we said they received a bye in the preliminary round, started with some good games, but lost the last 4 and finished last in the group behind Singapore. However, the points they earned there were enough to see them as one of the top 5-place finishers. So they didn't have to undergo kind of more playoff rounds this time. Their record was good enough to make it to round 3. And in round 3, they started with a draw against Philippines, but then lost 2 games to Palestine and somewhat shamefully to Mongolia, who finished ahead of them, leaving them last place in the group. So not close to reaching the Asian Cup this time, as in 2019. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our look at Yemen. And so we will move to our second team, Sri Lanka, beginning with an overview of their participation and strength. So once again, the graphics look pretty small here, but we will expand on them. Okay, but in terms of participation and overall strength, Sri Lanka first entered the Asian Cup in 1972 and the World Cup in 1974 under the name of Ceylon at that time. Their participation in both tournaments was patchy. In the World Cup, they entered and then withdrew in both 1974 and 1978, and actually didn't enter again until 1984. From that time, though, their participation has been consistent. In Asian Cup competition, after successfully completing qualification in 1972, they didn't enter in 1976, and then 2 tournaments in a row in 1988 and 1992. Finally, they withdrew in 2007. So put another way, they've been consistent in participation since 1992, except for that 2007 withdrawal. Their participation in all 5 editions of the AFC Challenge Cup, that's a tournament for weaker Asian teams from 2006 to 2014, was flawless. They were there for everyone. Their participation has been almost flawless in their local competition. That is the South Asian Football Federation, or SAF. The tournament began in 1993 and has 13 editions up to 2021. And they were suspended for the 2023 edition, which is the only time they have not participated. So good participation record there. Whew. Okay, in terms of overall strength, they declined from a 4th-tier team to a strong 5th-tier team, and then down to a weak 5th-tier team. Now they lose most games, but in the past they have stolen a few points from 3rd-tier teams, mostly in the 1980s, and also a relatively strong period around 2006. At that point, they at least dominated other 5th-tier teams and earned some campaign-level achievements as a result, though that is only visible at the low levels of the AFC Challenge Cup and in their local tournament. And actually, this has dropped off in recent times, where they struggle even against the weakest of teams. Okay, let's take a closer look at their World Cup overview. Sri Lanka usually doesn't get past the first step of qualification, be it a group stage or a preliminary round. They did pass I'm having trouble with that word today. They did pass preliminary rounds in 2006 and 2022, but were well out of their depth in the following rounds. Despite some campaigns where they lose all games, they have taken points, as we've mentioned, even from some fourth or weak third-tier teams. Only in 1998 and 2002 were these enough to keep them off the bottom of the table. But unfortunately, that has been their fate in all campaigns from 2006. And we'll take a closer look at that in the deep dive. But here we're continuing with overviews. And so let's look at the Regional Cup. In Asian Cup competitions, Sri Lanka has never come close to reaching the Cup. They did earn some good results in early campaigns, most notably a 4-0 win over Singapore in 1980 qualification. However, as time went, their only points came from other fifth-tier teams. They were thus well suited for the AFC Challenge Cup, a tournament started in 2006 for the weaker team in the region and played in lieu of the Asian Cup. Sri Lanka did actually enter the 2007 Asian Cup, the bigger competition, but they withdrew. Meanwhile, in the first Challenge Cup in 2006, Sri Lanka went undefeated against fifth-tier teams all the way to the final, where they lost to fourth-tier Tajikistan. Sri Lanka continued to dominate fifth-tier teams in qualifying for the Challenge Cup, and they did reach the next two editions. But the level of teams in the tournament grew stiffer. I mean, the competition grew stiffer while they seemed to grow weaker. And they were knocked out at the group stage in the next two and then failed to qualify for the 2012 and 14 editions. They and all others returned to the newly formatted 2019 Asian Cup, but having fallen in the preliminary round, they were relegated to the Solidarity Cup. That is a revised version of the Challenge Cup, now specifically for teams knocked out in the early rounds of the Asian Cup qualifying. But anyway, I will stop there because we're going to cover this stuff in the recent games section. So let's move on to the local cup overview. As mentioned, they are members of the South Asian Football Federation, or SAF. I'm actually looking at the games at this level, or the tournaments at this level, gives a good measure of Sri Lanka because it's a very weak locality made up of fourth and fifth tier teams. India is the strongest and they are a fourth tier, sometimes third tier team, but mostly fourth tier. So this tournament for Sri Lanka also shows a general pattern of growing weaker in recent times, especially. They finished second in the first edition in 1993 and actually won the tournament as host in 1995, coming second and then first in the first two editions. In the next edition, they finished in the top four, meaning that they passed the group stage. And from then on, they were usually knocked out at the group stage. But in two tournaments in 2008 and 2009, which is a period coinciding with their best results in the AFC Challenge Cup, they passed the group stage again. 2008 and 2009. They only did it one more time in 2015 and otherwise finished knocked out in the group stage. In 2023, though, they were suspended by FIFA and it was the only time they didn't participate in the tournament. Okay, let's move on to a deep dive for their World Cup qualification. So Sri Lanka played no games in the aborted 1974 and 1978 campaigns. In the first, they hadn't been placed into a group before they withdrew, but in the second, they were in a group of six with actually all Southeast Asian teams, 5 other Southeast Asian teams. So after that, they didn't enter the next 3 editions. So really their history begins in 1994 as far as World Cup qualifying goes. This was a 5-team group stage in 1994, and they lost all games, including both legs, to Bangladesh, who finished ahead of them. They returned to the World Cup in 1998 for their most competitive campaign. After a loss to group winner Qatar, um, they tied India and beat Philippines for a second place finish in the semi-final round. This was by far their best result. 2002 also saw them avoid a last place finish by besting Pakistan. However, they grew weaker after that and have never managed to avoid the bottom spot since. They passed a preliminary round over Laos in 2006, and they managed home draws with Indonesia and Turkmenistan in the semi-final round, but they still finished 5 points back in last place. 2010 saw an impossible pairing in the first round, and they lost both legs to Qatar, though only by a goal in the first leg at home. The preliminary round in 2010, or the first round, was not good because it had too many strong teams, so the weak teams stood little chance there. In 2014, the pairing was a little bit better. They were paired with Philippines. And once again fell at the preliminary round there. And then it went from bad to worse in 2018, as they lost both legs to fifth-tier Bhutan. Both Bhutan and Sri Lanka having been ranked among the sixth weakest teams in Asia, so not even able to make it past Bhutan there. And we will look at the 2022 campaign when we get to it in our recent history, and that actually begins now. But we go back to the Asian Cup in 2019 to look at their recent history. So there we saw that they were knocked out in the preliminary round. We saw that actually in 2018 World Cup qualifying, because that made up the first two rounds of 2019 Asian Cup qualifying too. So they were knocked out by Bhutan, as we saw. So they were kind of, I don't want to say demoted, but a tournament exists for those knocked out in early in Asian Cup qualifying. And it's called the Solidarity Cup. And it's actually, this one was played in 2016. Which was shortly after that preliminary round. So Solidarity Cup 2016 usually played among the weakest teams in the region. And in that tournament, they lost the first two games to Laos and Mongolia and only managed to draw with Macau, so finished last in the group stage. As you can see, Sri Lanka now looking very weak, even amongst the weakest teams in Asia. Their next tournament was their local cup in 2021, the SAF Cup, or South Asian Football Teams. And here too, they looked very weak among the weak and lost to Bangladesh, Nepal, and Maldives. Kind of ironically, that the one game they did earn points in was against the strongest team in the region, India. They earned a draw there, but finished last of 5 in the group, well behind the other teams there. 2022 Asian Cup actually saw them pass the first round, but it was really a stroke of fortune there. They were paired with Macau in the preliminary round, and they lost the first leg in Macau, only 1-0 though. So they had a chance going into the second round, which was played at home. However, Macau refused to travel to Sri Lanka. They thought it was unsafe because there had been a bombing there. However, FIFA did not agree with them on this and awarded the game to Sri Lanka 3-0. So Sri Lanka kind of passed without having to play the second game, and they reached the second round there. Despite mostly respectable scorelines in the semi-final round, especially a competitive 2-3 loss away in Lebanon, they were out of their league here and they lost all games. They didn't finish last, however, thanks to the withdrawal of North Korea. So they finished 4th of 5 in round 2 of 3, and that actually does become significant when it comes to 2023 Asian Cup qualifying, which we will get to shortly. But first, we're going to look at their local cup in 2023, the SAF Cup, but not much to look at there because they were under suspension, and so they didn't participate in it. So we do go to the 2023 Asian Cup qualifying, and just to remind you, the 2022 World Cup qualifying that made up the first 2 rounds saw them basically awarded the win over Macau in the preliminary round, and losing all games in the second round, but not finishing last because of North Korea's withdrawal. So actually, because of that, despite earning no points, a 4th place finish earned them promotion to the following round, round 3 of 3. Had North Korea not drawn out, they would have had not withdrawn, I should say, they would have finished last in the group and then had to go to playoff rounds and probably the Solidarity Cup. But they made it through to round 3, where they lost all 3 games. I got to say, fairly respectable scorelines here: a 3-0 loss to Uzbekistan and a 2-0 loss to Thailand, or fairly competitive scorelines. However, a 1-0 loss to Maldives. Maldives is a 4th-tier team, so a bit stronger than Sri Lanka. They finished 4th in the group behind Maldives there. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of part 2, the long section, the history of the teams. And now we jump to part 3, where we look at the teams in comparison to each other. So let's begin with the pot numbers. The bottom 20 teams in the region had to play in the preliminary round. So the bottom 10 were in pot 2. And anyway, they were divided into 2 pots of 10. Yemen was in pot 1, and they were in the middle of that pot, 31st in Asia. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, was the bottom of pot 2, making them at this point the weakest team in Asia. They were 46th in Asia, and so obviously a lot weaker. In terms of the FIFA rankings, Yemen is 156 and Sri Lanka is 207. Those are the most recent ones, rather than having changed a little bit since the pots were drawn. In ELO rankings, it's pretty much the same. Yemen is 177 and Sri Lanka is 224. So in both cases, they're 50 to 60 points apart. So Yemen looking very much the stronger team here. In terms of their ranking over time, Yemen shows a pattern of kind of improving in their rankings around 2017. But then falling back to a weaker, falling about 20 or 30 points to where it is today. That is not as extreme in ELO rankings as in FIFA rankings, but it does roughly show the same pattern. And in fact, while FIFA rankings have them ahead of where they were 10 years ago, the ELO rankings show that they've gotten even weaker over the last 10 years. However, they never drop below, they never drop down to where Sri Lanka is. Sri Lanka's pattern, on the other hand, over time, is over the last 10 years, is one of kind of growing steadily weaker, as we noted when they talked about them. So from at times looking like a strong 5th-tier team, they now look like one of the weakest teams in the region, and that's shown when they play against other weak teams. They tend to lose to everyone now. In terms of the head-to-head ranking, Yemen and Sri Lanka have never met, at least in World Cup or Asian Cup qualifying. And so there's no record to talk about there. The last thing we look at is the odds. And unfortunately, we couldn't find odds that kind of covered both games or the set as a whole. We could only find odds for the first game, which sees Yemen at home. So they have that advantage over and above all the other advantages that they have here. So the odds makers are giving Yemen 88% chance of winning at home, and Sri Lanka just a 5% chance of winning in Yemen. And again, we won't get into why that doesn't add up to 100%. But even if Sri Lanka is at home, I still guess that Yemen will be the favourites, and maybe that brings us into the discussion part of the media cast here. So honestly, this is one of the most one-sided sets of the preliminary, and it's kind of a problem. We saw in 2018 and 2022 that 12 teams were involved in the preliminary round, so teams are more likely to face another team that's of a similar level. When it's expanded to 20 like this, you get mismatches. So Yemen is far stronger than Sri Lanka, and poor Sri Lanka really doesn't stand a chance here. Despite Yemen kind of growing weaker over the past little while, they haven't come close to where Sri Lanka is in terms of weakness. So a really one-sided pairing here, and it would be an utter shock if Sri Lanka overcame Yemen here. They might have had a chance in a more limited field. So it looks like the end of the World Cup after this round for them. And as far as Asian Cup qualifying goes, the Solidarity Cup for Sri Lanka. Okay, that brings us to the end of set 7, Yemen versus Sri Lanka. And we look forward to meeting you when we look at set 8, Indonesia versus Brunei. We would like to thank Pixabay and Amaxi for the use of the music in this series titled Caledon, or Caledon Flute Beat.